Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. Boom, boom. All right, check-ins. I am absolutely exhausted, but I feel nice now, just like plugging in with Jason and Jared. I always like seeing those guys. So welcome to the Stoa. I am the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge, the rays of this moment. So there you go. That should be the new the motto. We just chop things. So for the new faces here, what we're having weekly sessions, or maybe we're having weekly sessions called the Mediation Campfire. And this concept or this idea emerged from a conversation that Jared and Jason and myself did on the Stoa podcast about having sort of around this digital campfire, just spitballing what is memetic mediation and how to make it happen in the noosphere. So this is sort of like high level discussion. Just FYI, there's a lot of insider baseball stuff may happen here. But we thought this might be the best way to kind of evolve the discussion, because both Jason and myself just submitted articles on memetic mediation to the side view. So this is sort of emerging topic and emerging conversation, but the three of us really believe that it's needed. And Jason and Jared, they have a podcast called Both End, and it's maybe it's the unofficial frame of being a memetic mediation podcast, or that's one of the explicit themes. So how today is going to work is that three of us are just going to jam for maybe like 5-10 minutes about memetic mediation, maybe stuff that we talked about last time, and then we're going to open it up to the group, and we're going to have a group discussion and see where it flows. So that being said, Jason, do you want to start off with initial thoughts?
Sure. Well, I feel like maybe we should introduce the concept a little bit, just because there are a lot of new faces here. And so for those that don't know, the concept actually came, I think it was coined by Peter. He's being humble, but it was coined by him, and in a paper with Connor Barnes, Culture War 2.0. And basically the premise, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, was that we're witnessing kind of this fractionating set of what are called memetic tribes, or what he called memetic tribes. And due to the nature of the internet and perhaps algorithms and things of that nature, there's these kind of filter bubbles or reality tunnels that are forming. And, they're internally coherent, give or take, but they tend to strawman outside groups, and they tend to think that they have the correct view on reality, right? And I guess coming at it from my point of view, and why I resonated with that term, and we started talking about it, is that for me, with the rise of the internet, there's a great opportunity to have some kind of collective sense making that might be some kind of alternative to the current institutions in society. But in order for that to happen, there needs to be some kind of robust information flow across all of these different communities, so that they can coordinate. Not that they need to like each other necessarily, but there needs to be some kind of common language or some kind of common translation. So at least, we're not strawmanning each other, and we're collaborating when possible. And so that's basically how I understand the premise. And it's an open source concept. It hasn't really been, put down into a set of formal heuristics or workshops, but it's something that Jared and I we've had this podcast for about a year, and we try and just bring on people from many different perspectives onto the podcast and just have a constructive conversation. So it's nothing really new, or it's nothing that none of us are familiar with, but it's I guess it's particularly meant for the online space, although it doesn't have to be in the online space. But it's just trying to have a better collective dialogue. I'll leave it there. I don't know if Peter, Jared want to add anything.
Want to jump in, Jared?
Nothing at the moment. Still kind of in a very open space right now. But yeah, I think that's a good description or a good foundation to lay at least. Actually, one thing I will say, if you didn't, if anybody didn't get a chance to watch this conversation that we had last week, one of the common themes was around seeing, or at least from our perspective, it seems like we see the memetic mediation as a longer term goal or orientation, as opposed to some sort of like, seeking, some sort of consensus reality in single sittings or something like that. So yeah, I think this is more of like a process orientation rather than some sort of short-term outcome oriented project. And I think that kind of shifts the frame a bit and allows us to be a little bit to occupy the kind of space in between, as opposed to cohering some specific memetic mediation tribe or something like that. So yeah, just to add a bit there, so that we don't get on that rabbit hole again, because I know we've been on it many times. So it's a common perspective.
Yeah, and so the last week there was like kind of like a debate between should we have a superordinate goal that unites all the tribes together and we have to get people rallying around that, or sort of like Jason's metaphor, just everyone grab a beer around the digital campfire, feel the warmth together and feel each other's heart, and that's step one. And then we can start talking business, propositional business. And what's merging out the stoa, so what's happening in my mind with this memetic tribal term, like asymmetrical communication. If you just start to talk about propositions and strange attractors on asymmetrical communication platforms like Twitter or Facebook, you're going to create memetic tribes because there's like a disembodied component to it. But what I like about this space of the stoa is that there's like an embodied energy happening, like existential dance party. We're dancing together. We're feeling the same things. Yesterday, Tyson, who's in the room right now, he did this freestyling through the pandemic. We're just all in this flow state. I felt deeply connected. Rhea's doing like snapping her fingers. It just felt like the energy was there. The love was there. And so I think there's something there to make that transition between the memetic tribe to the embodied tribe. And there has to be a more emphasis on community, however that community gets formed, over the broadcast medium.
Yeah, I can agree more with, and this is one thing that I recently wrote about, is that, and this is really just really basic and old school, but I think, before any of us, if we have disagreements in terms of ideology, worldview, things like that, I mean, it's so much easier to connect sub-ideological, and just, as Peter said, get a beer around the campfire, or share a love for a similar musical form, or some other aesthetic, play sports. All of these things are just kind of like old school, but it's really, it feels like, and that's why the internet is so, it's such a difficult medium sometimes for, or why the internet can promote discord, is because we're not having these embodied relational experiences, right? And so I think what you're doing, Peter, with the stoa and these more embodied things, even though it's still remote over video, is that we are developing more of these relational bonds. And then when we do get to like, okay, like the way you see the world is stupid, and I'm going to tell you why. Like when you start having that conversation, or at least, or maybe a little bit less, confrontational, there's a little bit more shared empathy and relational trust built, that you can actually, have a more good faith conversation.
Yeah, and I would also kind of add there too, Peter. I've seen this embodied component. I think the reason it's so important, kind of doubling down on these the things that kind of hold the tribes together are very cognitive and intellectual, and doing things like your little state checks or whatever you do whenever you open these sessions, Peter, of kind of getting into your body and being aware of your emotional relevance and displaying it to everybody, kind of being vulnerable with that. It's such a human thing that it's a great way to immediately realize that you're in in dialogue with other humans, and we're not here to just simply live in the memetic wars, I suppose.
Right. And I think I mentioned this last time. I did like that emotional check-ins with Jack Murphy, and I mentioned I was nervous or whatever. And then and invited him, I think, to mention he was nervous. And he's like, uber alpha male manosphere guy. So I think, yeah, just being in that presence, like modeling that, I think it's helpful. This is the last thing I'll say, and then maybe we'll just do one more round and open up to the group. But one thing I thought might be interesting is to actually explore ideas of how we can maybe seduce people into this digital campfire that have different ideological opinions, just to get them to feel with each other in a way. And I'll share an idea that Jordan Hall sent me via email the other day. So basically created a weekly news show that provides local weather, memetic like weather reports in a way from earnest members of different cultural tribes. Like Pat Ryan gives something from the Chans, BJ Campbell gives something from the gun culture, somebody from SJW land. And I think with my kind of ability to be a performative agnostic, and then this kind of space being as open as it is, I think this could be a good place for something like that. So I thought that was a really cool idea. And if anyone wants to take the lead on it, like, let me know. But I imagine there's other ideas that could emerge with that spirit. So I'm curious what you and Jason and Jared think about that.
I like the idea, and I'd actually really like to open it up to others soon to see what everyone else thinks. I mean, we would need, volunteers to, like we would need, like you said, seduce, like the people reporting on, okay, this is this kind of loosely knit subgroup of people that, have a, somewhat of a coherent worldview, if, at least implied. They would have to kind of be a trusted member in that group, right? Because, if we start having outsiders come in and give reports, and if it's slanted, it might, turn, I don't know, it just might not go over well, right? if members of that group that are being reported on be like, who is this guy? Like, we don't know this guy. Like, he doesn't know anything. Like, his bias is on his sleeve. No way, So there's just that. But I'm really curious to open it up to others and see what others think at this point. Go from there.
Cool. So if I trust the discernment of everyone in the group. So if anyone feels like they want to come off mute and just chat about anything that's been said, we'll just do popcorn style and see what emerges.
Who is the first piece of corn that wants to pop?
I will. I have a couple of things that are coming up. One is, like, it sounds like instead of coming up with like a sort of a central goal of what you're working on, I mean, there, at least part of it is like, how do you sit with multiple reality, like holding space for multiple realities at the same time. So there's the cultivation of that skill, which I don't know whether it'd be a goal in and of itself, but that's one piece. And then the other thing that came up is I just noticed a contraction in my system when you use the word seduce, that and I come from, I spend a lot of time in the 12-step world, and one of the things that we have is this concept of attraction rather than promotion. How do you attract, how do you make what you're doing more attractive, that instead of trying to promote it? Or there's something about that word seduce that I was like, I'm not a fan of that, but I do understand the concept from, it's like, you don't want to promote it, but at the same time, how do we get more people to participate in this? And I do like the idea of a weather report.
I'll pop. So, Kira, one phrase you mentioned was like being able to hold multiple perspectives or ideas. And to me, there are two creators that have good examples of like having the one creator have different discussions like with themselves as different people. So ContraPoints, if y'all know her, she has a couple of videos where she has like 3 or 4 different personalities. There's like cat girl left, and then like Neil, like centrist left girl, like have debating or something. And then J-Reg also, his is a bit kind of caricature like, but it's kind of entertaining, where he has all these different he uses the like the two-way political spectrum, and then has characters that sort of exist in each part of the spectrum. So at least from an entertainment perspective, those could be two sources of ideas or inspiration.
Yeah, the thing that's coming up on that is there seems to be two different orientations, and one of them, both of them I think are super valuable. I know Peter likes the phrase performative agnostic, which seems to be kind of like throwing yourself and embodying a certain perspective and feeling what it feels like to be coming from that orientation, which is very kind of like, I guess, primarily embodied technique. And then the other one would be kind of trying to occupy the space that surrounds each of the different perspectives. I think especially the performative agnostic, the kind of embodied orientation, seems to be a very direct route to kind of pulling out pulling on certain triggers and themes that you might be less or more sensitive, and so it feels like a little bit more of a direct route. But yeah, I don't know. I for me personally, I think I usually end up being a little bit more in the empty space around things, but possibly because I spent a lot of time kind of in my own ideological tribes and deeply embodied for quite some years, and it took a while to crawl myself out. So yeah, just some random thoughts to throw in there.
I'm really, I think I'm really curious if anybody wants to share in their own, life or memetic space, if there's, if there's certain kind of, worldviews that are kind of in tension with each other, even within yourself, right? Because one thing that, I don't know, the way I think of it oftentimes is that, we're trying to mediate tribes in the outside world because there's warring tribes within us, right? And there's warring ideas within us, and memes and worldviews that create some kind of cognitive dissonance. And so I'm curious if anybody would like to share, in your own sphere, what some of those dissonant, mental models are, either that you observe but you're kind of participate in, or it's just purely internal. If anybody would like to share that.
I'll share. And sorry, I think I'm just a number and no face. I don't know how to change that on my phone. But one that I've observed recently is this cognitive dissonance between, I guess, kind of like wanting to be pro, like on the progressive side of things, wanting to be pro restorative justice or pro like anti-mass incarceration and pro forgiveness or pro not judging people by the worst thing they ever did. But then on the other side, not wanting to lend that to people who commit sexual abuse of power. It's like, how on the one hand can I be pro forgiveness while being pro zero tolerance for perpetrators of sexual abuse? It's something I've kind of come up against a little bit in my work, is that cognitive dissonance, but that is something I've witnessed. And then I just wanted to throw in a response to the previous question of what kind of, or kind of the previous topic of what kind of tactics might help facilitate memetic mediation. I have this little, I guess it's a practice that I developed, and I also just have to say, as someone who has attempted to facilitate conversation and interaction between different worldviews, it's really hard to get, like, certain worldviews are in and of themselves not particularly interested in interacting with other worldviews. Like that is of interest to some memetic tribes and not others, right? Liberal literally means open, and that is a value that some memetic tribes have. I think that could be an interesting like meta column in the, you know, memetic tribe spreadsheet is like, how interested are you or open are you to even kind of engaging with and acknowledging the other tribes, or even acknowledging that you're like one of many tribes. But anyway, the technique is, I call it where I'm coming from and what I have done. And I'll just give a specific example. So I did this at Facebook with Facebook employees, and then like non-Facebook employees who were there for an event. And I have people do a little bit of guided writing about, in this case, it was like, it just how like how we feel about Facebook, our hopes and fears about Facebook. And then people put all of their writings in a pile at the front of the room, and then people come up one by one, pull out a testimonial and read it out loud in first person as if it was their own. And it's just a very simple way of inhabiting where someone else is coming from. And often it's kind of disarming, because often it's really obvious that someone is reading something that they don't agree with, but there's really nothing else to do other than just kind of like speak another person's perspective in first person and just get inside of it and see where that takes you. And it kind of just brought some humor into the space, which was really helpful for them kind of getting down and dirty and having a conversation between Facebook employees. And like, I don't need to go into the specifics of what the event was, but it just kind of injected some honesty and humor into the room so that we could actually just kind of like have a real, I guess you could say, kind of somewhat memetic mediated conversation.
And I included a list of conversational modalities that Richard Bartlett and I and John Vervaeke kind of are collecting. So if you have any you want to add there, and some of these I think could be used for various memetic mediation exercises.
Maybe I think on that last note, that was just mention that there's memetic tribes that don't even want to engage other ones. So I think that that's one that I belong to generally, where there's very little interest in even like really perceiving external worldviews in an active fashion. Sometimes things trickle in, but no one's really interested. I am an Orthodox Jew living in Israel, for that background. There's not really so much interest. There's not extreme antagonism usually also, just kind of like this indifference. But there could also be antagonism or admiration to a certain extent. And that's why I kind of actually going back to Peter saying seduce, I felt like that is kind of a way where it's almost, I wouldn't say trickery, but listening also to the session last week, where if you take a bunch of people and say, let's just get together and talk about our ideas, our different ideologies. So you're doing a very strong selection bias there. Like you're only going to get the people who are actually open and interested to a certain extent, who are seeking that. But if you kind of do, oh, we're doing this breathwork session, and through there you're kind of creating these personal connections that you guys are talking about, that could be like a starting platform, I feel, for onwards. I feel like that there might need to, if you want to really get like the heavy hitters, you might have to kind of trick them to creating personal connections around something different. Otherwise, you're kind of treading water, getting the guys who are already kind of open beforehand anyway.
Or appeal to them using their telos, or their goal, their intention, and ideally kind of like create something for them that appeals to what they're seeking.
Yeah,
it's funny, this the image of the Trojan horse seems to be very alive in my experience right now, and there, I think I've seen a number of different instances where people are kind of seduced. One of them is kind of the back door of like, presenting it as one thing when it's actually something else. So this would be the stoic breath or something like that. And you're just setting up circumstances where people have to be in dialogue or in relation with people that they normally wouldn't be with. And it's a very soft approach, and one that I think is, kind of essential. It has to be part of the group anyway. And then there's another one that's maybe a little bit more manipulative, but also still it's still truthful in its own way. And I think could possibly be valuable with some of the most combative tribes. And that is just your enemy meme. I know I've heard a lot of stories of people being kind of stuck in one area or one ideological perspective with a clear idea of who their enemy is, and wanting to figure out how to defeat them. And so they kind of expose themselves deliberately to their enemy to understand them, and then kind of come out the other end realizing that maybe there's a lot of assumptions that were being made that they didn't quite understand. There's like a very provocative story of a black jazz player who befriended a bunch of KKK members and ended up converting a bunch of them just because his curiosity of not understanding where they're coming from and wanting to understand why they hated him. I don't know. I'm sure there's some other Trojan horses that we could think of here too. Just some thoughts there.
Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, well, I don't want to cut off this conversation. I was just going to say that Rasmus, who's not sure that the internet will allow him to speak, had a number of observations. I was going to read those, but I don't want to cut off the train. If this is you want to take, go ahead, Peter.
Go for it. I can.
Okay, so this is from Rasmus. Unless he wants to try and speak now, I don't want to steal his words.
I like to try, but
okay.
it may lag so to me.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so the basic idea here is just to have a prior knowledge before we engage in a conversation. And so there's 3 major areas where this prior knowledge could be. So yeah, like the first, so the forum. So and sorry, by the way, this is developing for some time. So it is but I watched the video for you last week and worked on this specifically for today. So hope it fits in. So the first thing is, what kind of forum? So what is the aim, the goal? So do we need to arrive at something or just discuss? Or then also to have knowledge about how different truth processes works. And so some kind of agreement about that. And then also like your own contribution. And many of these things is not something you can just like read and then know, like you have to embody them, like you also say. So a lot of learning in doing this, but for me about mediation is just that if you can have this shared ground, then you can also, and then it's rational, it's sensible, it's made with some logic that is everyone can hopefully agree on is for the better good, for the better conversation. Then you can be held to this standard. So there's a standard that can hold you. Yes.
So a couple of fragments are coming up. So I like that sort of a training program of memetic mediation. Like maybe one step is what Connor and I tracked on that spreadsheet, just propositional levels, what they believe to be true, so you can pass their ideological Turing test. Then maybe the other step is to method act their reality tunnel. So what do they feel when they believe what they believe, right? Like what do they feel in their body? And then like have the capacity to process there. So I'm in the position, I feel quite strongly about this, that you can't really speak with anyone unless you know what they're feeling, right? If you feel their emotional reality, because you're just going to misstep and say the wrong thing. So I like the idea of maybe a training program emerging. And a previous fragment that came up is kind of like the battlefronts of the culture war. Like what are the hot spots right now? And maybe have a spreadsheet that like tracks that, or some way to track that. So like I'll mention one that I'm concerned with right now, but one that I'm not too concerned with, but it's a battlefront, is trans medicalists versus the trans trenders. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. So in like the trans community, there's people who think that you only can be transgendered if you have gender dysmorphia. And then if you don't have that, then you're just a trans trender. And then they have like war between each other. And then ContraPoints got involved in that. I think she got sucked up in that little war. So that's a battlefront, and maybe someone's called to mediate between that. So that could be a thing. Battlefront that I'm concerned about is the conspiracy theory battlefront with QAnon, and then how that's fractionating. I was talking to David Fuller from Rebel Wisdom about this yesterday, and it looks like a demon is being born through this kind of like collective dialogue, and the Trumpist movement is associating with it as well. And there's a lot of intelligent people in that community plugged into it. So it'd be interesting to have conversations there. But yeah, I like the idea that there's some kind of like tracking system of all this, and then see who's called to mediate it. Like maybe people who can speak to both in such a way. And the last thing I'll say is that I wrote this article with David Gosley called Marginal Figures. And this came up when Ben was talking about like marginal figures, someone who has their foot in the tribe and the foot outside of it, but they're really respected by the tribe that they belong to. And Ben, you kind of remind me of that. Like you seem like a marginal figure in your tribe, right? Because you're plugged in. Maybe I'm misreading right there. No, okay. You say you're not a marginal figure. You're not a marginal figure. But I think there is characters who can speak to their own tribe and then can speak outside of it too. And those are the kind of the figures that we've got to like find and then get them in this digital campfire.
Well, people who have gone from one tribe to another, bridge people, exactly, Raya. I figured out how to make myself not a faceless number. But there is a podcast called Reckonings that tells the story of people who have shifted their political worldviews, transcended extremism, made all kinds of transformative change. Those people are bridge people. So yeah, people who have shifted from one tribe to another can speak to the tribe they came from and to the tribe they came to, and obviously have the kind of like meta, just kind of like understanding of tribes existing, period. So yeah, those are very valuable voices here, I would say.
I don't want to change the topic radically. I think this is continuation, I feel intuitively, although I don't know exactly. Just an experience that I had this week that I felt very much wanted to kind of present just to hear also people's opinions. This week I accidentally stumbled across a website called, I think it was the Internet Intifada, which is a very strong pro-Palestinian website. And I'm not like a strong ideologist. I'm so aware of the fog of war that it's so I don't have a strong opinion anything on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But just being and seeing the things from the other perspective and seeing things radically different really shocked my system in an embodied way, things I knew intellectually, I experienced otherwise. But one thing that struck me very strongly and connecting to the memetic mediation is that I felt like the argument on all sides almost boiled down to the facts, in the sense that every side, if they were charged, like, no, we don't do that. If we did do that, we'd be terrible people, but we don't do that. Where that was kind of the perspective, everything. And I was kind of thinking about in memetic mediation in general, where you have people with these such strongly different values, where maybe it's not really a difference in values, maybe it's a difference of interpretation of objective facts. And maybe they can kind of connect. Like, we all want social justice, right? We all want people to be treated equally and nicely and humanely. Well, what that means because of the facts is a little bit different. I wonder how that could kind of flow in.
What popped into my head, Ben, as you were talking about that, is something from George Lakoff at Berkeley, and he wrote something that this was more in terms of the larger conservative versus liberal idea, but the idea of the underlying metaphorical models that each side had, and it was a difference not in it wasn't a difference in values, but a difference in ordering of the values. They had the same values, they just ordered them slightly different, and that slight difference was a big made a huge difference. And I'm trying to think of off the top of my head. I mean, it's like they both valued love, but how they expressed that love was, compassion. Like for the conservative, it was more of the strict father type of compassion, whereas for liberals, it was more of like the, compassionate mother type of underlying models. That's what I thought of as you were talking about that, because the thing that's so interesting is that the differences are slight. I mean, it's the ordering of values. It's not that the values are very different. It's just the order that people put them in.
Right.
And how do you bring that to the surface?
That's really, really good. What's coming to mind, the term a protean superordinate goal. So the superordinate goal always shifts depending on what kind of conversation you want to emerge. And when you were talking, what came to mind is that I had this event in person lined up. It was supposed to be around May, but COVID happened, and it was Extinction Rebellion, the representatives of Extinction Rebellions in Toronto, talking with the effective altruist community, because they have a similar superordinate goal. They want to save the world, respond to the meta crisis, but the responses are radically different. And just having them together to chat would be nice, build some bridges there. Maybe I'll do it online in the Stoa now, but I like that idea of kind of sniffing out those battlefronts and then saying, okay, what is the framing that they're going to track both of them to get to the campfire?
What's coming to mind right now is like what, for kind of self-styled memetic mediators, what does it mean to be a trustworthy person who can build trust in certain communities as somebody that maybe you're not even a marginal figure. They'll tolerate you, being part of their conversational space because you're not attacking them, and you're friendly with them. But you're a person that, they come to rely on to, one, translate ideas and memes from other tribes from the outside world. But they also see you as an asset in a way that, well, maybe they will represent our worldview sympathetically to the outside world. And so as a mediator, one thing, that I think about is, okay, which tribes do I feel even remotely qualified to even build trust within? Because I don't think any of us can cover the whole range, right? With limited time, energy, and we just, our life experience precludes us from, I think, sympathizing with everything, right? Unless we're just completely zen about everything and we actually don't really understand it. We're just, we're not actually getting into the meat of it. We're just, floating around. Sorry, Jared. It's not an attack on you. Maybe it was. Anyway, so yeah, this is more of like an inquiry prompt of like, we think about, okay, which groups can we build relationships with a couple people, one or two people in the group, in order to, when things flare up, because if there's no battle line, if they're just different worldviews and they're coexisting peacefully, then, well, it's not really a big deal if they're pretty separated. But when things flare up, all of a sudden, like you're well positioned to be a mediator and to translate, intentions and goals and values and facts and everything else among these groups.
Yeah, to be a bit of a contrarian here, and I guess kind of on this broader theme, I think that mediation, the first kind of connotation with mediation is this kind of peacekeeping effort of, mediating when mediation is needed, and it's obvious. And I think I actually have my intuition. Well, I think both it's true in many ways. I also think it's more of a kind of like a last ditch effort, in the sense that most of the most effective mediation that I see is happening when the mediation isn't known about. So it's kind of like very Taoist in the sense of like the best leaders are the ones that nobody knows they're leading. And, so a lot of times that might look like, so we brought up a couple different things. Like one of them is like, if there's just fundamental disagreements on what is true, I'm very skeptical of making any kind of conflicting investigation into breaking down barriers. And actually, I think in a lot of cases, it actually just makes them stronger. And what tends to be the most interesting for me, and I think Jason and I do this a lot on both end, is have people on the podcast who have strong beliefs and take a genuine interest. Obviously, I think this is the core here. We have no agenda, but kind of exploring the boundaries of those beliefs and trying to maybe kind of loosen them a little bit, play with, where there's some paradoxes might come up with, where some uncertainty starts to be engaged. and you know, sparking maybe some curiosity of what's beyond those boundaries, or how somebody else might see it differently. So yeah, I guess the provocative claim here is that I think most of the effective mediation that I feel happening when it's happening is when it's not seen as mediation. It's just a co-exploration and relational kind of dialogue or interaction. And I mean, it doesn't even have to be dialogue. You know, I think you know, to get into our embodied space, I've definitely danced with people where they kind of pushed me out of my you know, my preconceived notions of what dancing is or something like that, right? Like this is something that is unfolding on many different levels, and really it's kind of relationally pushing the boundaries of kind of concrete ideas of where things end and begin. Yeah, I don't know, something to throw out there.
I'll jump in here and say, wow, you guys, just before I lose myself completely, I just want to get onto the floor, but I love the idea of the weather reports, but perhaps speaking from that place, but rather than for it, but speaking for yourself. And so that the transparency of your own inquiry could be there. And Jared, I like what you're saying just lately about the not going directly for it, but indirectly, and even to really follow that to the extreme. If you did something like action learning and really support people from one of those tribes to have with a problem, to voice that problem, to ask clarifying questions about it, and then to look to add resources and support for that to happen, to make it a really safe place. But the space would be a lot connected and safer when we speak, you know, our own truth with the weather reports and really make that safe and invitational for people to do it, rather than having them sort of labeled with their tribe. And I love the writing exercise that Stephanie started off with. I think that's fantastic, and that could really be good. Yeah, a few thoughts.
Tyson, did you have something you'd like to say?
I think so. I'm interested in sort of invoking a conflict that I experience and then seeing what happens from that. For me, a lot of people that I am either friends with or just acquaintances or friends of friends on Facebook are like, a lot of their biggest concerns revolve around like max vaccinations and 5G. And so there are like there's some of it which seems like a lot of sensational conspiracy theories, and then there's other things that also scare me quite a lot. And then I also I feel like I'm coming from a tribe that would just like their forebears would be like Eckhart Tolle and other spiritual teachers, and I'm coming more and like also they're very much about like get out of your head and into your body, like out of your head. It's like to be in your head and to think is like, that's almost like the sin. And so I really like to use my mind and to think and to be in conversations like this. So this is a tribe that I've been attracted to. And then a lot of people that I see that are thinking very thoughtfully and that I see as being very intelligent and smart are very strong against anti-vaxxers. So like Sam Harris is an example of someone I think is a brilliant mind. He's very thoughtful about things. And he talks about being an anti-vaxxer as like this horrible person or something. But like max vaccinations scare me quite a lot. But I would be very interested in like hearing from somebody that is much more equipped than me, an expert in vaccinations and how they're done and why they can be done safely and how they can be done safely and how we could have vaccinations with and not have to have the fear. So that's something that when I think about it, I almost want to like kind of hide from it because that conversation scares me. And I also fear like disconnection from some of my friends, people that I care about my relationship with them. And so I see how some of that conversation as well for them would be difficult to have in a grounded space.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing to that, using like the max vax kind of thing, is that something that I noticed in my space and also in the anti-vax. I have friends who are anti-vax, and so we get this paradox where, and I think this is also true, anybody who's informed is pretty much informed because they're a strong proponent of one side. Like if anybody like really knows their stuff, it's not they came in knowing their stuff, they came with a strong opinion, and that's how, and they kept on amassing the information that sustains them. And then you have people who are really kind of like you, and I also feel this way in many things, kind of like agnostic, like I just want to know. You can't really, you feel like you can't trust the experts either, because they started in that direction anyway. So I'm just adding to your confusion.
And I will just say here too that this is these groups. So I have some conspiracy folks in my family and stuff like that. And yeah, I think that every time somebody else in the family tries to disprove them or argue with them, it just is always a disaster. And this would be, you know, so we've kind of talked about two things. One of them being that memetic mediators really benefit from having previous tribal experience so that they can relate and create some rapport with the people and some trust to explore. But I think there's also an equally interesting role, which is the curious, ignorant perspective. But it has to be true, like, right? You can't be like, you can't be the Socratic, I'm gonna ask you questions until you look stupid. It has to be like a genuine exploration of the boundaries from somebody who doesn't know anything. And if you're able to dialogue long enough, you'll always end up at a I don't know. And if a conversation ends with an ideologue with an I don't know, I feel like that's always some mediation has happened there. It's kind of loosened the grip a bit.
Mm-hmm. Jason, you had something to say?
I mean, a very like quarterly formed thought. So let's see. Well, I was just thinking how, you know, we're all very, I think, you know, multifaceted, not just in this group, but everyone. And if we do have some kind of coherent worldview, it's kind of a composite board of many different influences that we kind of figured out how to stitch together. And what you were saying, Jared, about, you know, just simply inquiring in good faith, and, you know, not trying to prove anything, but just you're building up some kind of rapport, and that might not lead anywhere on that particular issue, but just building up that rapport with that person on some other issue, you know, all of a sudden you have some trust built that, you know, perhaps some mediation can happen, you know, down the line, right? And so again, going back to the notion of embodiment and relationship, you know, I really think that's really, you know, the driver of memetic mediation is just good old fashioned relationship building, finding some area where you can connect, you know, and it's almost impossible not to find some area that you can connect with somebody, right? And starting from that foundation, and then, you know, when you start getting into the more sensitive issues, you have a little bit more affordance to do that without everyone just shutting down immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and to add to that, I know, Jason, you like to talk a lot about how memetic mediation is kind of a spiritual practice as well. And I think the spiritual component comes in here about when it comes to in these attempts to have relational dialogues with somebody that you might not have a bunch of familiarity with. If we're metacognitively aware of when some sort of strong emotional reaction comes up, that is, you know, that's a practice in its own is showing you that there is some sort of preconception or solid idea about this topic that then can be kind of explored. And the tricky thing here too, and it can be hard sometimes to do it while you're in the conversation, but I think it's always really important to, after you've kind of come out of something, if you felt like you came out triggered, to then just get back into your body and feel where that triggering is. You know, maybe it's, you know, my shoulders are super tense, or I'm feeling anger, or, you know, like however it presents, like exploring that in a curious way as opposed to some sort of resistant way, is what is actually loosening it. And you know, counterintuitively, you know, like when we see how much that emotional resonance is kind of what is creating the barriers and boundaries, then we know that the way to deconstruct them is also to get into our bodies as well and kind of explore the sensations And the more we do it too, the more you start to see that these solid ideas that feel solid in our body as well, if you look closely, you see there's some kind of movement there, kind of exploring the boundaries and stuff like that. It's surprising how much this actually affects our cognition. But it's definitely a spiritual practice. You know, this is a lot of what meditation is all about.
Yeah, mediators also need to be mediated, right? Like I think we could be pro mediators in some domains and complete, culture warriors in other domains. You know, I definitely, still do my share of warring on the internet. And, I rely on my buds to point out my blind spots, right? And the reason I think it's a spiritual practice is, it does require humility. And, like as we're mediating, we're also being mediated, even if it's not by somebody else. Like we're also have to go in with the spirit of learning, because we might have blind spots, right? And as we're trying to mediate somebody else, we might also, get triggered, and then we have to emotionally process that. And, our sense of identity that's attached to a worldview has to get loosened. And that's, to me, that's spirituality 101, right? Is, your sense of identity keeps getting bigger and expanding, and, or, depending on how you want to phrase it, but it takes less solid forms, right? It's more nebulous, I guess you could say, more non-dual.
Right. I feel called to say something. This is at the nice edge of my thinking, and then I'll stop talking, and then we'll close up. I like this idea of really like seeing like the logical end and the emotional end or the conclusion of a memetic tribe, and going there and going all the way with it. And I'll tell you one thing that happened to me when I research these tribes. I try to feel them too. And so when I was researching all these conspiracy theory tribes, like fired up the Tor browser and just started reading, like it's like nonstop reading about all this type of stuff. And I'm not going to talk about the accuracy, because I do think there's signal to some of that. I think a lot of it's noise though. But just the spirit, the essence of it. Because when you read that, you become radically paranoid. You can't trust anyone. Can't trust any of your loved ones. You can't even trust yourself. I remember a thought occurred in my mind, like, am I an MK Ultra agent? It's like, you just become radically paranoid. And then that's an opportunity to build a state, a relationship with that state of radical paranoia. And at the nice edge of my thinking, I'm thinking that like that conspiracy theory energy is like the death of communitas for a collective. And yeah, I'll just let that sit for a moment and see if anybody has anything to say.
Things that come to mind. I last year went into a foray down into the chans, and like, yeah, I had that same experience of the paranoia and being introduced to like, oh my God, these are like, there were things that came up and I was like, okay, I need to slowly back away from this and be in relationship with myself. And so, yeah, I like that framing of being able to be in relationship to that paranoia, because how can you converse with somebody if you can't understand the feeling of where they're coming from? And the other thing is, I quickly glanced at the document that you put out, Peter, and the term connection gyms, and this thought that has, my husband and I have had this thing of like an emotional dojo of being able to do, like my biggest fear is getting people is someone getting angry at me, and so I won't necessarily like I could there are probably situations where I could push a little bit harder, but I'm scared of the response. And so a situation in which like that could be like tested and tried and practiced, I would like, there's this part of me that's like, wanting to figure out how can I make something like that come to fruition, is being able to practice that. Because being able to, be on that knife's edge of like, okay, how far can I push before I push somebody too hard, right, and they recoil, but without like getting intimidated, talked out of it by my own, fear of other people's anger. So something, yeah, I'd love to see something like that. And
Hmm.
my mind's kind of working of how can do I have the courage to do something to try and set something like that up?
So I have a desire to double click on your daemon, Kara. And so I had a similar thought. So this, what's emerging out of the Stoa is going to be like a wisdom gym, I imagine, where we can practice all these things. And I don't know if anyone heard about emotional affective patterns. It's an acting technique in order not to get trauma. When you do method acting, an actual acting technique, you can do breathing patterns where you hold yourself in a certain way. And then if you breathe in that way, reliably, you engender a certain emotional state. And so like if you want joy, you kind of like close your eyes, you have a smile, and you have a cascaded breathing through your nostrils. And you do that, then just joy just starts bubbling up. And then you can build a relationship with that. You can do that with fear. You can do that with anger. And it's a sort of primordial fear, primordial anger and hatred, I imagine, as well. So it'd be really cool having a motion gym where you do that, build a relationship with it, and then be friends with it, and see what maybe thoughts emerge when they come up. Emotional affective patterns. I'll write it in the chat box in a moment. But we should close out. I just want to open up the floor for anyone who has any who hasn't spoken. I'm looking at David, my metagaming friend. But anybody who has any thoughts they would want to share who hasn't spoken before we close.
I just wanted to briefly comment that, Peter, I love your strategy of like reading the conspiracy things and seeing what it's like to be that. I love that. That's like one of my favorite things. Is like, I call it like gonzo anthropology. It's like you're doing anthropology, but you're like projecting the state of other people onto yourself. So for like the last like, I don't know, 8 months or something, I've been suffering from Twitter brain, just from like seeing what it's like to just, and like besides a shortened attention, there's like been all these other sort of things that come at play, and I'm still like trying to put them into words. But if you have the wherewithal to sort of experiment with different news sources and all that, I'd suggest, trying to immerse yourself in these different milieus and memetic tribes. So.
And I just put something in the chat box. Lubomir Arzov and I had an exchange on parapolitics, conspiracy theories, and Robert Anton Wilson called it guerrilla ontology, which is similar to the gonzo anthropology that you were talking about. And that's sort of like really method acting, reality tunnel. So that being said, let's close out. I just maybe hand it over to Jason and Jared if you guys have any final thoughts before we say goodbye.
I guess my only final thought is if folks are interested, we do have a Slack group, a Memetic Mediation Slack group, where it gets, sometimes it's more active, sometimes it's less active. People get busy, but we kind of discuss various topics and strategies for mediation. But also, sometimes we have our own little inside wars, I guess you could say, which are always fun, and it's good kind of little training ground. So if people are interested in that, maybe Peter, I don't know if you want to put the link in the chat box as well. And so, so it's a way to kind of keep the conversation going. I think obviously video is a better format. Like I vastly prefer this than chatting, but that's kind of might be an in-between, bridge.
Oh, yeah. There's so many directions that were coming up as we were talking that I could have gone down. So I'll just rapid fire say a couple. Kira, your kind of emotional dojo, and Peter, your the emotional affective patterns and things like that. This sounds like it's a kind of personal way of doing trigger practice, emotional trigger practice. But I really, to speak to some of this method acting or performative agnostic role or just embodying certain perspectives. I really love the idea, Kira, of setting up a certain situation where both people are put into a certain character, and possibly even a character that has a stance that you don't even agree with, but are in opposition to each other. And the goal of it is to like get each other really angry or mad and just kind of push boundaries. But there's no personal identification to the ideological content that's in the thing. But your body doesn't know the difference, I think, especially the more you get into it. So yeah, this kind of relational emotional effect of patterning seems very rich. And yeah, I'd be very fascinated if you're into exploring that more. I think that'd be really fun. So feel free to reach out to myself on Twitter or something, and anybody else that thinks so. I'm also on the Memetic Mediation Slack channel. But yeah, this was fun. I think it was kind of like we started out with a very shotgun approach, just kind of like everybody just airing what they're thinking about, and it kind of felt disjointed, but then it kind of seemed to pull together at the end, and we found a thread. So this was super fun, and excited to see what happens next week.
Yeah, I agree. That was a lot of good stuff emerged. Rhea, do you want to briefly talk about your oxytocin party later tonight?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that I joined this conversation, because I feel like what essentially I'm offering tonight is a series of embodied relational experiences to help support this dance of memetic tribe and an embodied tribe. And to really so tonight's going to be more fun, lighthearted, but in hopes to really create and cultivate a safe space to not play it safe. So the more that we can cultivate trust and empathy and vulnerability within each other, the more that we can continue to grow and just have this synergistic relationship and keep building on it. So I'm excited. It's going to be a lot of fun. And if you're around, I would love for you to join me.
Yeah, I was a little bit nervous about it, but now I'm like really excited, because I think the nice edge needs some fun right now. So thanks everyone. And I think we'll have another one next week, but I'll confirm with Jason and Jared. All right, guys. Take care.
Yeah. Thanks everyone.